Your lecturer is Dr. Grant Hardy. Dr. Hardy is Professor of History and Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. He received his PhD in Chinese language and literature from Yale University. Dr. Hardy is the author or editor of 6 books, including most recently, Understanding the Book of Mormon, A Reader's Guide. He is also an award-winning teacher, having received UNC Asheville's Distinguished Teaching Award for Humanities and a Ruth and Leon Feldman Professorship for Outstanding Service. One of his proudest achievements is that he has written or rewritten most of the articles on Imperial China for the World Book Encyclopedia, putting his name in every elementary school library in the country.
Welcome to a course on sacred texts of the world. To be honest, I'm a little nervous because in these lectures, I'll be talking about books that matter a great deal to many people. We'll be discussing texts that have been read and reread, that have been loved and even revered for centuries, in some cases for millennia. People have lived by these books and sometimes have even been willing to risk death in order to preserve them or to stay true to a particular interpretation of them. So as we begin, imagine a world in which the printing press had never been invented, where the only books were those that had been painstakingly and laboriously copied out by hand. How many books would you own, particularly if you had to copy them yourself? Which books do you love enough to write them out longhand, page after page after page? Many people would start with texts they consider sacred. Or from a slightly different angle, if there were a fire, which books, if any, would you try to save? It's not always a hypothetical question. In the early morning hours of October the 23rd, 1731, the great classical scholar Richard Bentley was staying at Ashburnham House in London, where the Royal Library had recently been relocated. About 2 o'clock in the morning, he awoke to the smell of smoke and he jumped out of bed to try to put out a fire that had started near a stove chimney. As the flames rapidly spread and the paneling caught fire, he ran upstairs and grabbed the Codex Alexandrinus, which he carried in his arms as he escaped from the burning building. Witnesses reported that Bentley had the presence of mind and the dignity to put on his great wig before his mad dash to safety. Of the 958 volumes in the library, 114 were totally destroyed and another 98 were damaged. The book that Bentley had saved, however, was particularly valuable. The Codex Alexandrinus, written in the 5th century, is one of the 3 earliest and most important manuscripts of the complete Greek Bible. So that's the New Testament in Greek plus the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. I'll talk more about this in a later lecture. This volume, the Codex Alexandrinus, had been presented to King Charles I in 1627 by Cyril Lucar, the Patriarch of Constantinople, who wanted to thank the English with an extravagant gift for their help in his struggles with the Turkish government. The very early version of the New Testament that the Codex Alexandrinus has been crucial to establishing the most accurate Greek text possible. Today, the book, and that's the very one rescued by Richard Bentley almost 3 centuries ago, can be seen in the British Library, though you don't have to go that far anymore. In 2012, the New Testament portion of the Codex Alexandrinus was digitized and put online. With a few clicks on a mouse, you could be looking at it within minutes. Such tales of sacred texts that have survived through the centuries, sometimes through extraordinary efforts and sacrifices, are not rare. The burning house scenario is common enough that there's a section of the Jewish Talmud in the tractate Shabbat devoted to the question of whether it's lawful to rescue sacred writings from a fire on the Sabbath. Okay, remember that there were a number of restrictions on all sorts of Sabbath activities, including what you could carry. The rabbis in that tractate consider whether it makes a difference if it's the Torah as opposed to the prophets or the writings, and I'll explain those divisions in a future lecture, or whether it matters whether the text is written in Hebrew or whether it's a translation in another language. But in the end, the consensus is that rescuing scriptures from flames is a good thing, even on the Sabbath. By coincidence, October 21st, 1731, the day that Richard Bentley sprinted through the smoke to grab the Codex Alexandrinus, was a Sunday. Okay, I know Sunday is the Christian Sabbath rather than the Jewish Saturday, but it does appear that Bentley did the right thing, according to at least two religious traditions. And these are just accidental fires. In the late 2nd century, when rabbis were putting together the earliest portion of the Talmud, so that's the Mishnah, craftsmen in China at the same time were carving the Confucian classics onto stone tablets. For 8 years, from 175 to 183 of the Common Era, teams of carvers inscribed about 200,000 characters on 46 stelae, about 7 feet tall and maybe 3 feet wide, in part to prevent any repetition of the famous burning of the books that had happened 400 years earlier, when the first emperor of China ordered the destruction of all Confucian writings that were held in private hands, and he threatened execution for any scholars who persisted in teaching them. Most of the Confucian classics survived the first emperor, which is different from the fate of the Zoroastrian sacred texts, most of which were lost in the fires of Persepolis that were set when Alexander the Great invaded Persia in 330 BCE. Even today, Zoroastrians lament that they have to make do with the fragments of the scriptures that were collected during the Sassanid Empire, so maybe in the 3rd century of the Common Era, which consist of only about a quarter of their original holy writings. Aren't you a bit curious about what's in these books that means so much to people? Sacred texts are not just significant writings in a culture, they're often considered the most important books, the kind that people were willing to copy by hand and to rescue from destruction. And they're frequently the first texts to be translated into foreign languages. I want to get things right in this course, because sacred texts can often be studied and pondered for an entire lifetime. I'm well aware that some of my listeners may know more about a particular book or scriptural tradition than I will ever know. The Library of World Scriptures is huge, and in most cases I, like you, am an outsider. I'll provide an overview of the sacred writings of 7 major religious traditions, based in chronological order, along with descriptions of holy books from another half a dozen lesser-known or smaller faiths. But at the outset, it's worth considering why it might be useful to read other people's scriptures. It's easy to understand why someone might want to spend time with their own sacred texts. For believers, these are books that promise ultimate truth or salvation of some sort. They can tell you how to connect with the divine, and they can offer guidelines for living or even commandments that can only be ignored at one's spiritual peril. But what if you're not a believer in that particular religion? What if you're not really moved by their claims to transcendent truth or doctrinal authority? What might be in those texts for you? And why focus on Scripture in the first place? There's no question that religion is a significant part of the lives of most people around the world. So studying various belief systems offers an important window into understanding global politics, thought, and culture. In order to get along with others, to know them for who they truly are, you need some sense of how they see themselves in relation to the cosmos and tradition and other people. And those relationships are often defined by religion. Yet religion encompasses more than just scripture. There's also ritual and ceremonies and practices such as meditation or yoga or humanitarian service. There are ecclesiastical organizations and formal theology, sacred spaces and artifacts, ethical codes, a community of fellow believers, and so forth. Why have a whole course devoted to Scripture, just one of those aspects of religion? I'll give you 4 quick reasons now, and then I'll save another for the end of this lecture. The first advantage of focusing on Scripture is accessibility. As wonderful as it might be to visit a Zen monastery in Japan, or to observe a pilgrimage in India, or to take part in Holy Week celebrations in Israel, realistically, only a few of us will have those opportunities. Sacred texts, by contrast, are readily available in bookstores, in libraries, and on the internet. If you're curious about Buddhism, or Islam, or Taoism, or Sikhism, taking a look at the writings they hold sacred is an easy, safe way to go. You can read as much or as little as you like on your own time schedule with no pressure and no embarrassment. And if someday you want to follow up with a visit to a worship service or with conversations with actual believers, you'll have a basic understanding of the tradition and you'll have something to talk about. The second reason for sacred texts is centrality. Sacred writings are generally not peripheral to religious traditions. In most cases, they communicate core values and beliefs, and sometimes they're the glue that holds a religion together. For instance, there are several different types of modern Judaism, but they all share a reverence for the Torah. Sunni and Shia Muslims all recite the Quran. The hundreds of Protestant denominations and sub-denominations are united in their reliance upon the Bible. And the even more diverse communities of Hindus look to the Vedas as their most authoritative texts. Reason number 3 is comparability. It's true that some religions don't have sacred written texts. Instead, they may have oral traditions that are passed down by religious specialists from generation to generation, as is often the case for indigenous religions of Africa or the Americas or the South Pacific. That's not necessarily a bad thing, and in fact, many or even most of the scriptures of the larger world religions started out as oral traditions that were eventually transcribed into written form. But written texts are surely easier to study side by side in comparative ways. For instance, we can investigate the role played by poetry or historical narratives or law codes in various scriptural traditions. With printed translations of sacred texts, we can more easily discern the themes and the insights and anxieties that characterize various religious communities. Now, not all religions use scriptures in the same way. For instance, in a later lecture, we'll see that Shinto is a notable outlier. And Jainism is a religious tradition that actually has divergent sets of sacred texts among its different denominations. There's a remarkable variety in the types of writings that people hold sacred and how large their canons are. But at least we're sort of comparing apples to apples here. It's easy to be overwhelmed by the religious diversity of humankind throughout history, and Scripture gives us something of a common ground from which to start a conversation. The fourth reason to study sacred texts is I think there is beauty and wisdom and awe to be found in them, even for those who come to a particular scripture as outsiders. These are books that have survived because a lot of people have found them useful and inspiring. They frequently offer novel insights and fresh perspectives, or even just call attention to truths that seem to be universal. For instance, reading the Bhagavad Gita and its teachings about acting without being attached to the fruit of actions has made me think more deeply about how much self-interest there is at the heart of most of what I do. Confucian texts have helped me appreciate how much of my identity comes from my relationships with others. And when I first heard the Buddhist doctrine of the 5 aggregates, so these are the 5 components that make up what in other traditions we think of as a soul, I realized that my own ideas about the soul and the body were too simplistic, and I became more aware of impermanence. After reading Taoist scriptures, I think differently about death and about how my body will eventually be recycled by nature and how I should feel about that. I love Confucius's injunction that the only time your parents should worry about you is when you're sick, and the observation from the Buddhist Dhammapada that all we are is a result of what we have thought. and the assurance from the Quran that God is nearer to us than our jugular vein, or that there is no compulsion in religion, and on and on. But I don't want you to think of world scriptures as quote books that you can pick and choose from at your leisure. Biblical scholars constantly warn us about the dangers of proof texting. That is, of taking a verse out of its context to support whatever point we're trying to make. Perhaps you've seen those religious discussions in which two people throw down Bible quotes, quote after quote, like cards in a poker game, except, unlike in poker, no one wins and only hard feelings result. It's much better to look at scriptural passages in context, to try to understand what the authors had in mind, how they fit into the larger scheme of things, and how believers have interpreted them over the centuries, and what they mean to communities, the communities that have accepted them as being particularly authoritative or sacred, and how they respond to those texts. That's the sort of overview that this course will provide. Ideally, reading other people's scriptures will be more like a window than like a mirror. Rather than just looking for confirmation of our own assumptions, right? Look, that guy must be inspired because he agrees with me. Reading sacred texts can show us things that we haven't seen before. I don't think that deep down all religions are pretty much the same. In fact, quite the opposite. There are fundamental differences in the ways that people of various faiths understand the basic problems of life, as well as the solutions that they put forward. But even if the religions of the world can't all be true or can't all be equally true, they can nevertheless all be legitimate, by which I mean that we can say, I see your point, and I can see that you have good reasons for believing that way, even if, in the end, I'm going to disagree. If done right, reading sacred texts of other religious traditions can offer a door to understanding, a bridge to harmony, and a mutual respect that acknowledges profound differences as well as similarities. But how do we do that? Well, the good news is that there has never been a better time for cross-cultural, interreligious exploration than right now. We can compare our situation to that of an earlier American who was very curious about sacred texts from around the world, Henry David Thoreau. You may recall that for 2 years, from 1845 to 1847, Thoreau lived in a tiny one-room cabin that he'd built himself at Walden Pond. He had only a few books with him, mostly Greek and Latin classics, but also an English translation of the Bhagavad Gita, and he expressed an interest in the Hindu Vedas and the Zoroastrian Avesta as well. In the chapter on reading from his book Walden, he complains that the best books aren't read even by good readers. He refers to the Western classics, and then he continues, as for the sacred scriptures or Bibles of mankind, who in this town can tell me even their titles? Most men do not know that any nation but the Hebrews have had a scripture. A man, any man, will go considerably out of his way to pick up a silver dollar, but here are golden words which the wisest men of antiquity have uttered. While living at Walden, Thoreau wrote a memoir of a canoe trip that he had taken a few years earlier with his younger brother called A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. And in this book, he shared a fond dream or an ambition. He said, it would be worthy of the age to print together the collected scriptures or sacred writings of the several nations, the Chinese, the Hindus, the Persians, the Hebrews, and others, as the scripture of mankind. Such a juxtaposition and comparison might help to liberalize the faith of men. This is a work which time will surely edit, reserved to crown the labors of the printing press. Thoreau was just a little bit too early, but his dream was realized about half a century later when Oxford University published the series Sacred Books of the East in 50 volumes under the direction of Max Mueller. It was a groundbreaking scholarly endeavor, with translations of the most significant sacred texts from Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, Jainism, and Islam, many rendered into English for the very first time. That series changed the way that Westerners regarded other people's scriptures, as can be seen in a comment by Max Mueller in 1884, 5 years into his project, when he said, "It was suggested that those books only should be considered sacred which profess to be revealed or to be directly communicated by the deity to the great teachers of mankind. But it was soon found that very few, if any, of the books themselves put forth that claim. Such a claim was generally advanced and formulated by a later generation. So we agreed to treat as sacred books all those which had been formally recognized by religious communities as constituting the highest authority in matters of religion, and might therefore be appealed to for deciding any disputed points of faith, morality, or ceremony." The key idea in that quotation is that it's religious communities that elevate certain texts to the status of Scripture, rather than some intrinsic quality that the writings themselves possess. And this is an insight that Scripture is made by faith communities, an insight that we will encounter several more times in this course. All 50 volumes of the Sacred Books of the East are online today at www.sacred-texts.com. Now, these are early translations, so they're not always as readable or as well organized as those you might find in, say, the Penguin Classic series. But the point is, you've got at your fingertips everything that Thoreau imagined. The trick is knowing where to start, because many of these texts can seem puzzling or strange at first glance. It's like you're strolling along a beach. There are shells all about. Some are obviously lovely, but others may be broken or half buried in the sand, and it takes a little more effort to appreciate them or to imagine the living beings that they once shaped and sustained. In this course, I can give you a quick tour of the shore. I'll let you know which shells are most common and why they look the way they do, and how they're related to other shells and where they come from. And then here, at last, is the fifth reason to read other people's scriptures. If you're skeptical or agnostic about religion, you can, like a naturalist, marvel at the variety and the creativity of our human species. You may gain an appreciation of what these texts mean to believers, and perhaps better understand why they've gone to such efforts to preserve, translate, interpret, and disseminate the writings that they hold sacred. If you're already committed to one of the religious traditions that I'll be talking about, you too may enjoy learning how people throughout history have made sense of the universe through sacred texts. But there's an added benefit for you. By recognizing and articulating near similarities and radical differences, we can better perceive the doctrines and sensibilities and features of our own scriptures. And we might find that our common assumptions are inadequate. As I was putting these lectures together, I realized some new things about my own religious tradition, one that I've grown up in for 50 years, and I saw the scriptures of my tradition in a different way and thought, oh, that's a way that makes sense. It was particularly learning about the Vedas and oral traditions of scripture that made me look at my scriptures in different ways. It's good to be challenged in our beliefs, and perhaps in our unbeliefs as well. In this course, you're going to meet intelligent, moral, spiritually attuned men and women who see the world quite differently from how you're used to looking at it. They're going to have concerns and critiques and questions that perhaps haven't really occurred to you before. Sometimes this may lead to a crisis of faith, but it might also allow you to look more deeply into your own tradition with fresh eyes, and that's often a good thing. For example, Thomas Merton, generally considered one of the most influential Catholic authors of the 20th century, was a monk who lived a life of prayer, contemplation, and silence in a Trappist monastery in Kentucky for 27 years. So he could hardly be accused of having a wishy-washy attitude toward his own faith. Nevertheless, Merton was deeply interested in other religions. He wrote several books about them, and shortly before his death, he gave a lecture in which he said, "I believe that by openness to Buddhism, to Hinduism, and to those great Asian traditions, we stand a wonderful chance of learning more about the potentiality of our own traditions. by which he meant our own Christian traditions. One of the drawbacks of being religious is that reading your own scriptures is most often a case of rereading. You get comfortable, perhaps even complacent, in hearing the same familiar words again and again. You know what they mean and how they apply to you. Yet the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber had a point when he observed that people who want to truly open themselves to a sacred text must take up scriptures as if they had never seen it. And that, of course, is exactly what we do when we look at other people's holy books. It's a good reminder of the time when our own scriptural traditions were new to us. Sort of like when my cello teacher used to bow with her left hand and then press on the fingerboards with her right, which is actually the opposite of how you do things, just so she could remember how it feels when it's all new to you. She was looking at me having a hard time and saying, okay, let me reverse it this way and try to imagine why you're having such a hard time. And then once you've had a chance to stretch your mind a bit, to step outside of your own faith community, then you can return to your familiar scriptures with new questions and see things in a new light from a broader perspective. I'm quite fond of Zhang Chao's description of lifelong learning. Zhang was a 17th century Chinese scholar and writer who had studied Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, and who had even talked to Jesuit missionaries. The quote is about reading in general, but I think that his insights apply to rereading sacred texts. Zhang Chao said, "Reading books in one's youth is like looking at the moon through a crevice. Reading books in middle age is like looking at the moon in one's courtyard. And reading books in old age is like looking at the moon on an open terrace." This is because the depth of benefits of reading varies in proportion to the depth of one's own experience. Thus, even a single much-read scripture can mean different things to a person at different stages in life. It's the added experience that leads to deeper, richer meanings, richer readings. So let's gain some knowledge and experience with sacred texts of the world, beginning in our next lecture with the scriptures belonging to what is probably the oldest continuously practiced religious tradition on the planet, Hinduism.